Hello, my name is Helen Bass, and today I kind of want to pivot away from the last two episodes that kind of unpack movie-themed analyses and really address a common question I get a lot from clients, which is, why is it that I feel worse sometimes after a therapy session? Isn't the point of therapy to feel good after? Well, the truth is you finally opened up, and sometimes you're wondering if therapy is making things worse. And today's video is just about a couple of insights from a licensed therapist that actively works with clients 4 to 5 days a week. And if you've ever thought maybe I'm getting worse instead of getting better, you're not alone in that. I hear that constantly. And today I want to explain why this can happen and why it doesn't automatically mean that something is wrong in your therapy session. So let's start with point number one. Therapy brings things to the surface. So let's say you're finally going to therapy, you unpack everything and maybe even some more. What I mean by that is clients unpack a lot more than they think they carry in a therapy session. A therapist's job is to unearth the pattern of your life, to also help you realize what you might be carrying, the beliefs underneath some of your levels of dissatisfaction, and it can make things worse. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better, and we often spend years engaging in painful emotions before we even know that we are, and therapy finally creates a safe space to acknowledge those really painful emotions. And feeling sadness or disappointment or rejection for the first time in a safe space can feel so overwhelming that it feels uncomfortable. And sometimes it can feel like you shared more than you wanted to with an actual person. And I've had those conversations with clients as well. Sometimes I'll hear apologies like, I'm really sorry for being too much for you. And it's kind of similar to feeling like you've never done something before. It gets really uncomfortable. I remember my first time going to Topgolf. My swing sucked, and it still really does. But I've gotten comfortable about the swing, about using different golf clubs, etc. And when you're first being vulnerable with someone, even with a trained professional, it can feel like there's a lot more than you thought you had, or a truth can come out in a session and it just feels weird or wrong because you're not used to that. And Brené Brown calls this a vulnerability hangover, a University of Texas Austin researcher and the writer of Dare to Lead, Daring Greatly, etc. She's a really big proponent of sometimes being vulnerable does suck, but it ultimately leads to your greatest healing. And being aware of your pain isn't always the same as creating said pain. There are a lot of things that can happen in a therapy session. And so just don't be afraid if this feeling happens, okay? Number two, your nervous system is reacting. Opening up can leave you feeling emotionally exposed. It can leave you feeling what some people say naked. And even in a safe environment, vulnerability can feel really threatening. Your brain may respond as if you're in danger, even when you're not in danger. And that's why some people feel anxious, exhausted, tearful, or emotionally hungover after a session. I've even heard some clients say that after a really emotional session, they're left feeling really exhausted, or they want to take a nap, or they need to take a break. Very normal. Sometimes you will feel that way. Point number three, shame often shows up after we're vulnerable. So thoughts like, I shared too much, I sounded ridiculous, my therapist probably thinks I'm a mess. Shame often feels louder because we're not used to being that real or that raw in front of another person. And feeling exposed doesn't mean that something is wrong. It just means that it's kind of like riding a bike. You're not used to it, and it's okay. You are with someone who's going to keep things confidential unless you're at a harm to yourself, others, vulnerable populations like children, the elderly, and that is okay. Sometimes the deepest wounds carry the deepest shame, and it's important to be present about that. And I would encourage you, if you're with a therapist, to communicate those things with them as well, because shame makes you feel like something is wrong. and that's important to address. Point number 4, awareness comes before change. Therapy can often increase some of your awareness about your patterns. I've experienced this just in my own life. When I've gone to therapy, I knew that something was wrong, but when I heard my therapist expose the anxiety or the generational trauma that I was experiencing and some of the familial tension that I was experiencing, it made things louder or a lot worse because I finally saw it in front of my eyes. And it can feel like things are getting worse because you weren't aware of the pattern. You were living blissfully unaware, but the pain was still there. And I kind of liken it to, imagine you go into the hospital with a pain and the doctor tells you that you have a certain illness, whether it's cancer or heart problems or diabetes. You knew that something was wrong, but the awareness of the problem and what's actually going on in your body can make it feel like, oh my gosh, I need to address this as quickly as possible, even though it was a progressive point up to that. So you may notice anxiety, sadness, self-criticism, more because you're paying attention in a new way, and it can feel like you're getting worse when you're actually becoming more aware. So if you notice that every time you criticize yourself, it could even be the inner critic is getting louder, simply means that you're hearing yourself for the first time. You're hearing how critical you are for the first time. You're hearing how anxious you really are for the first time. You're hearing how passive you can get with problems for the first time. And just remember that healing is not linear. One of my first jobs was in trauma. I worked with children. I also worked with young adults. And one of the most difficult things as a young clinician for me to learn was that progress didn't mean that a client was getting better progressively every single day. We're human, we make mistakes, and progress isn't in a straight line. I don't know if you've heard that before. There will be sessions that feel super hopeful, like you're moving forward in life, and sessions that feel really heavy, and difficult sessions don't erase your progress. Growth often includes moments of uncertainty, grief, or frustration even. And just don't forget that when you're in therapy, that it's unlike any other health modality. It's one of the few modalities where you're actually raw in front of another person. You're becoming aware of your patterns. You're trying to unlearn your self-sabotage and your inner critic. And it's a difficult process, and it's not always going to look easy. It's not like school. You don't progress from year 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you're dealing with something as complex as trauma, it's not always going to look simple. So just remember that. Another point number 6, is sometimes you're grieving. Like I said, with healing is not linear, and therapy can include grieving the childhood you didn't have. It can include relationships that hurt you, missed opportunities, and the version of yourself that was always trying to survive. And you start to become aware of some of these identities that you carry, that maybe you didn't have the childhood you wish you had, or the parents that you wish you had, or the support or the freedom that you wish you had. And it will come up in sessions. Sometimes it'll come up in random seasons of the year. I had a supervisor tell me once that seasons like Christmas or Thanksgiving, if you live in America, or even birthdays can bring up really emotional wounds. And it's important to normalize that feelings don't mean that something is wrong. We live in a society in the United States where happiness is the ultimate goal, or feeling good is the ultimate goal. But life is messy, and it's full of emotions that we don't always want to feel. And lastly, feeling worse is worth discussing. It's important to acknowledge that discomfort is part of the process. Discomfort and feeling it is part of the productive process. If you never felt sore after a workout, it probably means that you're not building enough muscle, right? If you're not pushing yourself to the limit as an athlete, you're probably not going to get to the point that you want to get to. And the same principle goes for therapy. Discomfort is part of the process, and feeling overwhelmed but if you're feeling overwhelmed for several days, if you're unable to function, feeling emotionally unsafe, or noticing that therapy consistently leaves you without enough support, that's important to address with a therapist, because maybe you need to get connected with other support systems. Therapy should challenge you, but it should also feel collaborative and paced in a way that supports your well-being. So you might be asking, what can you do after therapy? Well, first things first, give yourself time to decompress. I like to tell clients that after a heavy session, maybe give yourself time to walk, to journal, to process the emotions. Give yourself some leeway afterwards. Journal about what stood out. Go for a walk, spend time outside, stay hydrated, eat something nourishing, and practice grounding techniques like mindfulness, meditation, prayer, whatever seems right to you in that moment. And remind yourself that difficult emotions don't always mean that something is wrong. Discomfort can be part of that process. And so feeling worse after therapy doesn't automatically mean that something isn't working. Sometimes emotional discomfort is part of processing experiences you've carried for a long time. And at the same time, if therapy consistently feels overwhelming, please speak to your therapist. These videos are not a replacement for mental health advice. And so if you're already seeking therapy, I encourage you, if you're interested, to seek therapy. Great place to process if you feel emotionally wound up, etc. But speak to your therapist if you feel discomfort consistently after a session. And healing isn't measured by whether every session feels good. I just want you to remember that. It's often reflected in growing self-awareness, emotional flexibility, and the ability to respond to yourself with greater understanding over time. So if you've ever left therapy feeling like you're regressing or feeling worse, I hope that you are able to reflect on that, perhaps reflect why. And yeah, thanks for watching. My name's Helen Bass. I write a newsletter called the Sincere Practice Newsletter. The link will be in the description down below. I encourage you to subscribe if you are living in the California area and you're an Asian woman interested in therapy. I also provide that as well. Go to sincerepractice.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Wednesday.